David, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Shared reality. What is it and why is it important?
I mean, shared reality is just so fundamental to social connection. And I think this idea has been around in philosophy for quite a while. I've just been listening to the audiobook of Alain de Botton's Essays in Love that kind of touches on this, but doesn't call it the name shared reality. And essentially, it's just the idea that you create this little world with the people that you're communicating with. The kind of more intimate that world can be, the better. So shared reality is when you realize that you're having the same thoughts and feelings with the other person, that you're responding to the world in the same way, that you're processing events in the same way. So that can be brought about by just, validating what the other person is saying. But the more powerful forms of it, I think, are those kind of spontaneous signals that we give. And it could be non-verbal, so it could just be mirroring the other person's body language. It can be laughing at the same joke, kind of feeling chills at the same point in a particular song. It's all of these things that we have. Finishing each other's sentences is a great sign of having a shared reality. And psychologists have been studying this now for the last decade. So they've developed these psychological scales, these questionnaires that can measure how much shared reality someone has with another person by asking them things like, how often do you find yourself saying the same thing at the same time? And what they found was, quite simply, that the more shared reality people have, the closer they feel to each other. And that can be with, strangers who've just met in an online conversation, or it can be married partners who've been together for decades. But in all cases, the greater the shared reality, the greater the sense of social connection and closeness between the two people.
And can a shared reality be with a group? And I guess this is what many communities are all about. You go to a festival and suddenly you feel so connected to all of these people. Some of them become friends, some of them are strangers, but you're all experiencing this kind of shared experience of music, dance, whatever it might be.
Definitely. So, I mean, in psychology, we know that phenomenon is called collective effervescence, where you have this kind of shared reality with a very large group of people. And I think part of that is from knowing that those other people share your values, they share your vision for the world. So it would be very common in church or religious settings. But also, what's really good at creating shared reality is when you're physically synchronized in some way. And a lot of the things you mentioned, like singing together, dancing together, those movements, those actions are helping to synchronize our physiology. So we're getting the same hormonal responses at the same time. Our movements are aligned, which means that things like the actual neurological signals that are creating those movements are in alignment as well, but the brains become synchronized, and that seems to encourage a sense of shared reality. And when you have that shared reality between just two people or even within a big group, you find that you become more concerned about that other person's welfare. You start to act more pro-socially towards them. So creating shared reality is a really good way of creating a cohesive group, which is potentially why religions evolved in the first place, to create this collective effervescence, to create that shared reality. It helped to keep communities stronger, and then that would have ensured their long-term survival.
Very interesting. And what are some skills that we can learn and practice in order to deliberately create these shared realities? Because they can happen by default. You go to the same coffee shop each day and you speak to the barista, and just purely due to familiarity, you start to develop some banter and some jokes. But are there some skills that will help us to build that depth?
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right that shared reality can occur spontaneously. So one of my favourite studies looked at pairs of strangers who were given this task of interpreting images, kind of ambiguous cartoons. Essentially, they were asked to say what's going on in that picture. And what you found was that even within about 10 minutes, people started to feel that sense of shared reality. Not everyone did, but some participants really, began to finish each other's sentences. They were typing the same thing at the same time, and they felt instantly that they'd clicked with that other person. So when it happens, we realise it very quickly, and we know that we want that person to become a bigger part of our life. At some points, I think it is almost like the feeling of falling in love when you realise that shared reality is so profound. But it can also just happen platonically and professionally with your colleagues. You just know that they're your kind of person. I think the problem is that we often don't give enough opportunity for that to develop. And that's partly what the laws of connection was trying to discover, is how are we sabotaging our social potential. And one way that we do that is simply that we're a bit too shy and timid to give the signs that would be necessary for ourselves and the other person to recognise their shared reality is forming. So they might say something that you 100% agree with, and you feel a bit too reserved to validate them in that way. So you don't actually tell them that you've been thinking the same thing. You're holding yourself back a little bit. You might both be looking at a work of art or have gone to see a film.
Hello, it's Brad Hook here, and I'm delighted to share my new book, Start with Values. It is a guide to help you discover what matters most and then bring those core values to life through tools such as micro habits. It helps you make clearer decisions through the decision-making guide. It helps you to activate your values in conversations, particularly those courageous conversations where you need to assert yourself. And it helps you explore some potential shared values, such as nature stewardship, to help us all look after this planet that we call home. Inside, you'll find thought experiments, you'll find worksheets, you'll find action plans, and lots more. If you are interested in reducing your stress and building a life that's meaningful and purposeful, get your copy now. They're available on Amazon, both as a paperback book, such as this, and in Kindle format. So if you have some feedback, please log it in the reviews. I'd love to hear your experience of bringing your values to life. This approach has helped hundreds of thousands of people around the world, and it's now ready for you. Get your copy.
And you don't fully express how much that film meant to you, how much it moved you, because you feel vulnerable when you talk about your innermost feelings. But by holding back in that way, you're preventing the potential for that shared reality to emerge and evolve. So being more open would be my number one tip. Especially look out for those points where you can validate the other person and make sure that you say those words. Essentially, just be more explicit about how you feel.
One of my other favorite concepts from the book, the laws of connection, is the liking gap. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that, because I've experienced this so many times in my life, and I'm sure you have, and all of our listeners and viewers have too. Maybe you could unpack what that is all about.
Yeah, I mean, it was really the phenomenon that first led me to write the book. And so, like you say, we've all experienced this. We might meet someone for the first time. And very quickly we build that rapport. So maybe we get this strong sense that we do have a shared reality with that person, or that is emerging. But after the conversation has ended, we start to have doubts about the authenticity of those feelings and their veracity. So we begin to believe that maybe we felt strongly that we had this connection, but the other person, we suspect, probably didn't, that they were just being polite, that they were faking it. We start to play over in our mind all of those slightly awkward moments that are inevitable in any conversation. So even if you have a strong sense of shared reality with someone, there can still be a time when there was this silence that made you both feel a bit uncomfortable, or you saw that they looked momentarily distracted. We're not mind readers, so we can't know what the other person is thinking. We rely on these superficial cues, and we have a tendency just to be overly pessimistic about those. We assume that the other person probably didn't feel the way that we did. And so that's what the liking gap is essentially capturing, that these scientists just got pairs of strangers to talk in the lab, and afterwards they asked each of them to fill out a questionnaire that asked them things like, are you, how much do you like the other person on a scale of 1 to 7? Would you like to spend more time with them? Do you see them as being your friend? And they answered for themselves, and then they guessed how the other person would answer. And on average, everyone assumed that they liked the other person more than the other person liked them. So it was very, very common for people to experience this liking gap, and both parties were experiencing it. So you can imagine, you've met someone at the party, you leave, you would really like to continue the friendship, you'd like to call them to meet up for coffee, but you feel that it's no use because there probably wasn't the connection that you hoped there would be. Well, the other person may well be feeling exactly the same thing. And if neither of you are brave enough to overcome that liking gap, you'll never find out. And that's a major barrier for connection. So the reason I love the liking gap so much is that I think it shows us that it gives us really hard evidence, actually.
Hey, Brad here. Would you believe that around 70% of the people who watch this podcast have not yet subscribed? It would mean the world to us if you click that subscribe button on whichever platform you use so that we can stay connected with you and you'll receive notifications when we add new episodes. We really appreciate you coming and connecting with us and being part of our community. So all the best.
Social connection is often much closer than we think it is. It's actually often standing right in front of us. And because we have this innate pessimism, this cognitive bias, we're just not capitalizing on that. So just pushing ourselves to be a little bit braver to make the first move really does open up lots more potential friendships or potential romantic relationships, potential work collaborations. It's true in all areas of life, and it's very profound. It's made a profound difference to my life just recognizing that possibility.
And certainly in a time when we're digitally distracted and you go into most coffee shops, you walk into most workplaces, wherever you go, people are communicating less than ever before. This is what I'm noticing. People are all just scrolling on their phones. Even a playground, the children are playing and the different parents are standing around the perimeter just scrolling. This is not helping, right? So at some point, we just need to put the device away and be open to the potential connections that are out there.
Right, yeah, exactly. I mean, a couple of years ago, I met up with a colleague who had actually asked to meet me. He was a stranger, and he wanted some advice about some work he was doing. But, I was happy to meet up and to kind of chat. But he didn't take his headphones out of his ears for the whole time we were meeting. And I just thought, I know that's classically rude in anyone's estimation, but I wonder if people would have done that in the past, 10 or 20 years ago, whether it's now becoming normalized, that kind of rudeness. And I mean, it is rude, but also what was he going to get from the conversation if he wasn't going to really connect with me properly and devote his full attention to me?
That's really interesting. And I actually do notice that a lot, especially with younger couples who are out and about. Both are in their own little reality.
Right.
And it's certainly, they have conversations, but you wonder how much is actually getting through and how much of it is just reflexive, just, yeah, I'm doing my thing, you're doing your thing. I suppose at least they're together rather than being alone. But yeah, it's definitely something to be aware of, especially if you get older. I'm in my 40s now, and making friends can be challenging, but being aware that there is that liking gap can encourage you to just take that first step and just, any tips for dealing with rejection if it does come your way?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's something that I have thought about a lot, to be honest, because I do worry that this could be interpreted in a slightly toxic manner, in that people might think, well, like when people don't get the hint that actually, like, the other person doesn't like you. And, that's a nightmare scenario. And so I think we have to be realistic. Like, we're not saying that every single person you meet is going to fall head over heels in love with you. They're not always going to want to hire you for their business or to be your best friend and suddenly spend all of their time with you. That's just, that is also a statistical impossibility. But the fact is that we're just too pessimistic, way too pessimistic. So it's more about a slight recalibration rather than developing this kind of, like crazy narcissism. And there's also lots of reasons, and I think this is what we have to recognize, is that often it's not anything about us personally that would mean that someone didn't want to spend more time with us. When they say they're busy, they may well just be genuinely busy. We all have lots of things in our lives that we don't always have the time to meet up with a stranger that we've met. Maybe in other circumstances they would have wanted to. They might have lots of other things going on in their life, like mental health issues, whatever. Like we've got to recognize that like the world isn't centered around us. So a rejection also doesn't have to be personally about us. There could be multiple reasons. Psychologists call that a kind of defocusing, essentially, because we're just recognizing that the context is often as important as the things that we've been focusing our mind on. And it's a useful way of overcoming social anxiety, in fact. So, if you're at a party and you notice that someone you think gave you a dirty look, and we can really mull over that and agonize over that and imagine all of these scenarios in which they were thinking something terrible about us. But the truth is that they probably were just remembering that they'd left the stove on at home, or they'd eaten something unpleasant, or it could be any of these things. And actually just recognizing that there are all of these factors can help us to feel that we don't have to be on our best performance all the time either, that we can all relax a little bit.
I love that. I remember being at a workshop once and one person was staring at me with an angry look. And I thought, I have to try a few jokes because I got to get a smile out of them. Their face has to soften. How can they just dislike me this much? And it didn't change. And afterwards, she came and said to me, "Oh, I've got such a headache. I didn't bring my glasses today." And there I was thinking it was anger. It actually happened on a webinar once. There was someone with an angry face. You've got all the little facial expressions that were moving, but one person had frozen. And I kept looking at them going, why is she not responding to anything that I'm saying? It was just a frozen screen. So it's really interesting when you just realize that it's not always the right day for everyone to want to connect. I think that's the key.
Yeah, exactly. And, it really could be that what you are interpreting as being an angry face is just that they have forgotten their glasses and they're squinting because they can't see clearly. So just keep an open mind. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, is don't assume that everyone hates you. Don't assume that everyone likes you. Just be open to it. Be polite, be respectful. If you like someone, give them the opportunity as well to connect with you on a deeper level. And if they don't want to, don't take that personally.
In the book, The Laws of Connection, you have 13 social strategies that will transform your life. Which one of these, if you had to pick one, and I know that's a challenging thing to do, but if you had to pick one that has been perhaps the most popular or that you would have shared with your younger self, which one might it be?
Okay, so the one that I wish I'd been able to share with my younger self is about the liking gap. And that is simply, as I've just said, is just be more open to the possibility that social connection is close to you and that people like you more than you think. And, all of my shyness as a kid was, caused by this kind of rumination on thinking, kind of playing over conversations that I'd had, looking for all the faux pas that I thought I'd made. And the research on the liking gap shows that the other person probably didn't even notice them or has forgotten about them. They really don't care so much. In general, people are much more likely to focus on the warmth of feeling that you project. So whether you seem like you are interested in what they're saying and that you care about them, then the elegance of the phrasing that you use, or whether you repeated a word and you might think that you seem stupid and inarticulate, but they probably didn't even notice, that kind of thing. So it's all about warmth, less about kind of social competence and charm. I think that's really important to recognize. Another one, though, is about the power of gratitude and paying compliments. That might seem obvious that, saying nice things to people makes them like you more, but a lot of us are scared to express our gratitude or compliments because we think it's going to make us look a bit cringeworthy. You don't want to kind of fanboy or fangirl everyone you meet. We assume it's going to look a bit inauthentic, that we might seem a bit unctuous. Those perceptions really aren't shared by the person that we're complimenting. They don't see it that way at all. Again, they see this as a kind of warm, kind gesture. Now, and the research shows we just don't say nice things nearly as much as we could. We bite back the majority of the things we think about for people that are positive because of these fears. So we shouldn't do that. We should feel braver to be positive and to let people know that we appreciate them. Now, when we're paying those compliments or when we're expressing our gratitude, there are worse or better ways to do it. So doing it at all is good, but you're much better to try to be very specific. So the precision of your words is much better. So focusing on a particular action and the quality that it demonstrates in that person is much better than some kind of bland platitude, really. And too often we kind of turn our gratitude in particular, we make it all about us. So I'll give you an example. Let's say your computer's crashed when you're on a really tough deadline, and so you ask a friend to fix that for you. Now, a typical expression of gratitude might be, "Thanks so much. You've saved my bacon. It saved me, so much time and effort to retrieve that lost document." Now, nothing wrong with that, apart from the fact that you're not really reflecting the other person in that. You're just talking about the effects on you. And so it would be much more powerful if you would say, I really appreciate the way that you're always there for me when I need you, and that you took time out of your schedule to help me. That was very generous. And it's a small change, but it shows that you've actually seen them as a person. You're not just focused on the action and what it did for you, but you're really focused on the qualities that make you appreciate and love that person.
So empathy is a part of that. Being able to imagine almost like you've actually taken time out of your day. I understand the effort that was involved in actually doing this thing for me, and being specific about it rather than just, yeah, hey, thanks, that was a good job.
Yeah, exactly. And it's about recognizing that they are a generous person. I think that's really important too. So it's something about their personality that you appreciate, rather than it being this kind of fleeting action. You're saying that you see them as a whole person and that you know that they act like that regularly. I think that's really key as well. That's what the research shows us. And what I love about this research on gratitude is that showing gratitude or paying compliments to the person themselves, well, that is very good for your relationship. It makes you feel better about yourself too. So it can actually help to to kind of soften the stress response in the person expressing gratitude. We've seen that in an experiment that was a bit like Shark Tank or The Dragon's Den. I don't know if you have that in New Zealand, but yeah, people give these presentations to judges, and then they can win investment if their idea for this new product or service meets the judges' approval. Now, researchers did this with students, and what they found was that obviously it's quite stressful exposing yourself and your ideas in that way. But if just one member of the team expressed gratitude to their teammate, both parties showed a muted stress response during that presentation. So they both benefited from that. And I think this is because gratitude helps us to recognize our kind of resources that are around us. It makes us feel less alone. And so that makes new challenges feel more manageable.
And what about compliments? Complimenting someone can be a little bit of a minefield. There have been many situations where I would have loved to have said to someone, hey, that new haircut looks fantastic. And I'm sure they would have appreciated it. Or, wow, you look really fit, to someone at the gym, just because they do. But we hold ourselves back. Is it worth venturing into that territory?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, so I don't think there are any hard and fast rules, and I think we have to, there's an art as well as a science to this.
Yes.
I think my number one kind of rule of thumb with giving compliments is trying to think, well, does the other person want to be appreciated for what I'm telling them? Yeah, I mean, how can I express that? So I think it's easy to fall into traps where, say, a senior male boss could compliment an intern on her blouse, and maybe that would be fine. I mean, if it was, if it was expressed very demurely, or I don't know. Yeah, I think it's a minefield though to do something like that, because actually the power dynamic makes it a very awkward interaction. And does the intern want to be appreciated for the way she's dressed, or does she want to be appreciated for the work she's putting in? And isn't that really what is more important in your in that particular kind of social relationship. At the gym, if it's amongst two kind of equals, you've both got the same goal to get fitter, to build bigger muscles or to increase your endurance, whatever, then I don't see that as being so problematic. But again, it would depend on whether you knew that person, your tone of voice, and also kind of how you were expressing it. I think if you were talking to someone who you knew was working really hard on weights to kind of build muscle, and you were like, wow, you've really made progress lately. To me, that seems like a fine compliment, because clearly that person wants to, you're complimenting them on reaching the goal. That's the salient point there. If it was like just a random person who you don't know what they were trying to achieve, and you're just like, wow, you look great, it might feel a bit out of place and inappropriate. So yeah, compliments won't always be appreciated. And we have to use our empathy. It's like you said, we have to actually think, like, what does the other person, what are they trying to achieve? What did they want? How did they feel about me? How might they feel about what I say?
And maybe cultivate that shared reality first, so that there's a reason why you're actually saying that rather than just randomly. Which brings me to small talk. Do you think some advice is go in with a deep and meaningful question that almost shocks someone out of complacency? Or do you think there's a real place for small talk?
Yeah, no, I do. And actually, I mean, compliments can be part of small talk. So I think even if someone's a stranger and you compliment them on certain things that can't be misconstrued. So you could say to someone like, those are great trainers, someone who you've never met before. And
True.
I think that's unlikely that it's going to be misconstrued. Or just, like you said, I do think complimenting someone on their hairstyle is fine if you think that, it's really kind of exceptional. So, and I think compliments are often the easiest way of opening up a conversation, but again, just we can be careful about that. But definitely talking to strangers is, on average, is much more pleasant than we expect. Most people tend to dread having a conversation with a stranger. They hate that initial awkwardness, but both parties, on average, tend to feel much happier than they expect after the conversation. So it definitely is worth doing this to cultivate that instinct to just talk to people. I think in the modern world in particular, like you were saying, with the technology kind of pulling us into our own little bubbles, it doesn't mean that people don't crave connection. Most people really want to feel that they've been seen and appreciated, and small talk is a great way to do that. We just have to, again, be respectful. And if someone is giving signals that they don't want to talk to us, end the conversation politely. Like, don't take offense by it, because you can never predict what is going on in someone's life and when they might want a moment of privacy. But on average, people really do appreciate it. And that's worth remembering too, that more often than not, you're going to have a really good experience.
Yeah, it's in my own experience, when someone else has made the effort, or I have, or it's happened by chance, you usually leave more energized than when you began. And it's just this fantastic feeling. And obviously it's good for your well-being. You've just discovered a kindred spirit out there in the world, and it feels good.
I mean, that's what Nicholas Epley at the University of Chicago showed when he got people to strike up conversations with others on the commuter trains. The well-being of the people who did that, compared to those who were told to kind of savor their solitude, was so much better at the end of the day, because they had made that little connection, and then they gave questionnaires to the person that they spoke to, who filled in their experiences too, and they tended to really appreciate what had happened, what had passed as well. And in that experiment, it was more than 100 people, I think. I can't remember the exact number, but it's a really sizable number of commuters that he questioned. None of them reported a really bad experience. I think that's worth remembering too, that those really awkward experiences that we fear are vanishingly small. Like, people aren't actively rude, I guess, even if the conversation falls just a little bit flat.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite terms I learned from your book, The Expectation Effect, was the nocebo effect. I was wondering if you could unpack that and how it differs from the placebo effect before we have a conversation about the expectation effect.
Yeah, so the nocebo effect is really just the evil twin of the placebo effect. So whereas the placebo effect describes how when our positive expectations or beliefs can bring about an improvement in our well-being, the nocebo effect is when our negative expectations can bring harm to us and our well-being. So it can actually produce feelings of illness, for example. In both cases, we know that sometimes this is purely subjective. Sometimes it's hard to measure those differences objectively, physiologically, but in many cases, you do see accompanying changes to the body too. And so we have pain as the best example of both placebo and nocebo effects. So if you tell someone that they're going to receive a painkiller, even if it's just a dummy pill or a saline injection, they often do experience really significant pain relief. And we can see that in the way the brain is processing the painful stimuli. So you can see changes in the networks associated with discomfort, but also we can even measure increases in neurotransmitters that are associated with pain relief. So the brain's own endogenous opioids, we can actually see that they are released when someone is led to believe that they're going to experience pain relief. Now, the opposite happens if you tell someone to expect pain and discomfort. You're not going to see. Not only are you not going to see the release of those opioids, you actually see the release of a chemical called CCK that amplifies pain signals. So any discomfort that you are feeling will become much more acute, much stronger as a result of those negative expectations. So, it's fundamentally real. Like, our words are biologically active, and we can see that in the placebo and nocebo effects. But actually, as I explored in the book, the expectation effect, it also influences lots of other areas of our lives, like our health, our fitness, our diet, our sleep, all of these areas.
Even longevity.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's like the ultimate placebo or nocebo effect, where people who have a positive view of aging, who see old age as being a kind of time of wisdom and growth and opportunity, they tend to live about 7 years longer than people who have negative views of aging, who view it solely as a time of vulnerability, loss of independence, and illness and disability.
Can you tell us about the cyclists and the placebo effect and how this played out in real life?
There was this cyclist in the Tour de France called Richard Virenque, and he had heard, through the grapevine, that there was this great substance that was going around that would help him to get through the harder stages of the race. So he asked his member of his team, his coach, to provide him with this new chemical. And the coach told him, okay, I'll get some. He kind of injected it into his buttock like the day before one of the important trials. And then Veronk was like, he came back and he was like, that was amazing. I've never felt so good. He really did beat his personal best. He was fully convinced that this was purely due to the chemical that he had consumed. And then it was only then that the coach said that actually, at such an important point in the race, he wasn't going to start experimenting with a new kind of doping. So he had only injected a glucose solution. It was all in his mind. The athlete's improvement was purely caused by his increased belief. And that's what we see time and time again in experiments, looking at, illegal doping, but also just lots of sports supplements, is that the expectation of improvement is much more important than the substance itself. So if you consider something like caffeine, which is meant to help us for weightlifting, someone who's taking a decaffeinated drink but believing that it has caffeine in it performs better than someone taking a caffeinated drink who believes that it doesn't contain caffeine. So the effect, it's not that caffeine doesn't have any effect, but the power of expectation is greater than the power of the physical substance in those cases.
It's incredible. A neuroscientist was explaining to me recently how the brain is a prediction machine in some ways, and how it's always predicting what's going to happen next. And that actually gives us some control in terms of disrupting the pattern and shifting how we think about things. But it is fascinating to think that if I believe that, and this is not the secret kind of manifestation. It's more just unlocking the potential for me to do something that I might otherwise not do. Break through a limiting belief, which might be, I'm not good enough to do a podcast. Whereas if someone says to me, actually, you've got all the skills to create a great podcast, it's going to be amazing, and you believe that and actually get started, you probably can at least create something. Any other examples of the expectation effect in action?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I think dealing with stress or challenge is a really good one. I think our society has really made us see stress as this kind of terrible demon that should be avoided. And we know that it's bad for our health, but we also see it as this kind of sign of failure. So the moment that you start feeling anxious, you start to see that as being the evidence that your performance is not going to be up to scratch. And we feel that we've got to suppress the anxiety if we are to achieve our potential. That's been most common to me during public speaking, for example. When I first started promoting my books, when I started feeling anxious before getting on stage to give a talk about my books, I would interpret that anxiety as a sign that I really wasn't cut out for this. I wasn't cut out for public speaking. That I should just stay in my home and continue writing, but I shouldn't talk about it openly in public. But the truth is that the anxiety response, anxiety as an emotion and the stress response, they evolved to be adaptive. They're the physiological changes that are happening to us that we often find very uncomfortable. So the racing heart, shallower breathing, that sense of being kind of, your nerves are kind of jangling,
Yeah.
all of that
Butterflies.
yeah, exactly. It's actually good for us. Like the butterflies are good for us. They, when the heart's pumping more quickly, it's pumping oxygen to our brain, glucose to our brain. The cortisol is actually helping to release some of that glucose from our organs to provide more fuel for us to meet the challenge ahead. But by viewing the stress response purely negatively, we're creating this self-fulfilling prophecy where we're telling ourselves that we're not prepared, and so that becomes our reality. It's almost like we're adding just an extra level of catastrophic thinking, of fear and anxiety on top of the totally rational anxiety that is really just representing our wish to perform at our best. And so what the research shows is that you can make the most of that anxiety. You can make sure that it does work for you adaptively by just changing the way you interpret those initial feelings. So recognizing that they are there to benefit you, that they're there to help you to perform at your best. What that does is it removes that top layer of anxiety. It stops you going into that negative spiral. And your performance improves, but also your body responds better because it no longer sees this challenge as this major threat, this danger to yourself, and it sees it more as a positive challenge. And you've got all these resources to overcome that challenge. So what you see is that even though you show a stress response, it's just less catastrophic than the stress response when you have a negative view of stress. So cortisol does kind of peak, but it's not spiking so dramatically. You also see the release of other hormones such as DHEAS, which is a catabolic hormone or anabolic hormone that helps to actually protect and maintain your tissues. And it's really when that is released with cortisol, it helps you to benefit from cortisol's good points, but it prevents some of the long-term damage that heightened cortisol could cause if it's peaking too often. You see the same in your cardiovascular system, that your heart is racing, but your peripheral resistance, so how constricted your blood vessels are around the body, that decreases. So the blood is pumping, but it's got freer movement throughout the body, which is what you need if you're performing athletics, but also even if you're just standing still on stage, the blood's flowing like evenly throughout your body, so it's not putting so much strain on your heart. So in the short term, it's beneficial. It helps us to recover from the stress response more quickly. And then in the long term, because the stress response has been more adaptive, what you see is that you suffer from fewer of the longer term issues of stress. So you're less likely to have cardiovascular disease if you have a stress is enhancing mindset, irrespective of how much stress you're actually experiencing. So you can have someone who's in a very high pressured job who's experiencing stress day after day. But if they have this view of stress as being enhancing, what seems to occur is that the body is better able to cope with that stress. So their health isn't affected by the daily stresses in the same way that it would be if they had this view that this stress was slowly killing them.
Which is why in some of those elite teams like the Navy SEALs, what really differentiates them is they seek it out. They actually want the stress because their mindset is, this is going to make me stronger, rather than avoiding it and potentially seeking happiness, which is what a lot of people are after. I just want to be happy, and any sign of stress is a risk to that elusive, whatever it means, happiness.
Right. I mean, we see this, there have been studies of Navy SEALs. We've seen it in teachers, doctors, fire people, bankers, people in all kinds of professions with lots of different types of stresses. But having the positive view of stress as something that can be adaptive does seem to be beneficial in each case. So the role of mindset there is very powerful. And like you say, I think there has to be this recognition that stress, a little bit of stress in our lives, it's like the grit in the oyster that allows you to produce the pearl. And that was actually how I overcame my own stress about public speaking, about doing podcasts. I still do feel a little bit nervous, and I think that's natural and desirable, in fact, because that tiny bit of anxiety is keeping me alert, it's keeping me on my feet, it's making sure that I'm recognizing my need to perform at my best. If I was sleepy, drowsy, I don't think I'd be honoring the audience, really. I wouldn't be taking them seriously. It's because I take what I'm doing seriously that I do feel stress. And then I recognized just that it was exciting, kind of exhilarating to be facing something that I feared, and it was part of my growth. I didn't want to stay the same person that I was when I was 32, when my first book came out. I wanted to be the kind of person that I am today, and I want to grow in the future. And I can only achieve that growth if I put myself outside of my comfort zone and I experience that stress again. And sometimes, like, those stressful situations might go badly, and then I can pick myself up and learn from that experience and get on with it and, avoid the same mistakes the next time. But if I was always fleeing from stress, I don't think my life would be any happier. I think it would be a lot less happy, in fact, because I'd be living with the frustration that I hadn't achieved my potential, that I hadn't really done what I could to become the person that I wanted to be.
I've been experimenting with a question at the start of my workshops, which is, what is an achievement or milestone that you're proud of from the past year? And it seems like a fairly innocuous icebreaker. Talk to the person next to you. But then I share some research from my team at the Resilience Institute, where we found that people with the highest resilience, well, the number one factor supporting them, the key differentiator, was fulfillment. So actually stopping every now and then and looking at the view, what made this journey worthwhile? What did I do well? And without fail, when I ask people in the audience, so what is it that you're proud of? Often I'll go around the room if it's a small enough group. Nothing was easy. And that's the point. Everyone was really stressed at some point in the journey of achieving that thing that they're proud of.
Yeah, totally. I remember, like, when I first contacted my agent, because I wanted to write my first book, The Intelligence Trap. And then she arranged a meeting, and I was pretty terrified to go to meet her because I come from a working class background. Some people, I think, grow up with like literary agents, and publishers all around them. But I wasn't one of those people. My dad's a truck driver. So, and I felt nervous. And then I thought that it is like a first world problem, but it's like of course I felt a bit nervous. It was an important meeting, but would I have rather not had the meeting because to save myself from feeling anxious? Like, of course not. And I think that kind of recognition is really important when we're in the midst of the challenges, just to take a step back, like you say, and to almost savor the anxiety that we're feeling and recognizing that is actually something that we might look back on later on and see it as something that was quite exhilarating at the time. And, we would happily step on a roller coaster and appreciate the thrill of the ride there. But I think in our day-to-day lives, we're often averse to any discomfort, and I think that's bad for us.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Anxiety is just a signal that you care, is how I sometimes think about it. And do you think there's a space for visualization? So I'll give you an example. When I first started speaking to audiences, I had immense anxiety. And then I learnt about visualization, and I would just calm the nervous system, use some breath work and visualize the audience clapping at the end of what was a successful speaking engagement. And that just helped so much. It just helped downregulate that stress response, bring me back to a state of presence, and I'd get out there. And I don't think it ever didn't happen. It always eventuated. So do you think there is something there in visualization?
Yeah, I do. So I've actually been writing a piece recently about self-hypnosis, and there's really good evidence that self-hypnosis can be powerful, especially for pain. I mean, I think it's a shared mechanism with the placebo effect, and also it's very powerful for anxiety. And the self-hypnosis procedure often involves visualizing, like you said, like the positive outcome that you want, and also just getting your head around this idea that you can be a little bit more relaxed than you fear you're going to be. And what seems to happen is that when you're in the hypnotic state, so there's a lot of myths about hypnosis, but we're not under the command of a hypnotist, and obviously when we're hypnotizing ourselves, that would be impossible anyway. So it's not about delusion. But what seems to happen when you put yourself in the hypnotic state is that you increase your cognitive flexibility. So you just release some of the constraints on your thinking. It's almost like removing those nocebo expectations or allowing you to question them more easily. And so I think that's what's happening when we're doing that visualization, is that we're actively interrogating and questioning the worst expectation. And it's just recalibrating your brain's idea of what can happen. So when it's creating these simulations, as you mentioned, as a prediction machine, when it's creating prediction of what's going to happen in the future when you step on stage, when you deal with those clients, it's just allowing you to recognize that maybe it's not the big danger that you expect it to be and that it can go better. It's allowing you to have that more open mind, which makes your stress response more flexible. I think that's what we want really with the stress response. We don't always want it to be, the dial to be either one side or the other. We want it to be kind of gradated. And I think that's what visualization is helping us to do, in the same way that having that dummy pill can, or self-hypnosis can.
Makes a lot of sense. The Intelligence Trap is a book that you wrote in 2019.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear, what are some of the biggest myths people believe about intelligence, and what is the intelligence trap?
As a culture, we have tended to see intelligence for the last 100 years as this underlying brain power, this kind of mental energy that fuels all good thinking in any domain. So the more intelligent someone is, the more brain fuel they have, the more capable they are of learning, decision making, being rational, having critical thinking, integrating information, processing complex ideas. That was the idea. And what the intelligence trap was trying to do was to not to demolish the idea of intelligence as an important factor in our success, but to recognize that there are lots of other cognitive abilities and traits and dispositions that are equally important and that can determine how we use our intelligence. So the intelligence trap is essentially describing the situation where we use our intelligence to our disadvantage. And I see it as being like, you could have a car with a very powerful engine that can drive very quickly. But if you don't have the navigational tools, if you don't have good brakes, suspension, GPS, a reliable steering wheel, then that fast car can actually be a danger to you. You can drive that off a cliff very quickly. And what we need is all of those other tools to make sure that we use our own engines of thinking more responsibly, more wisely, more rationally. There are lots of examples, anecdotal examples of people who've fallen into the intelligence trap. So in the book, I speak about Arthur Conan Doyle, for example, who was obviously a highly intelligent man. He was a practicing doctor as well as writing the Sherlock Holmes novels, but he was fooled time and time again by these fraudulent mediums and spiritualists who got him to invest a lot of money in their craft, even though it was all an elaborate hoax. But rather, he had lots. It's not as if he didn't know the risks of what he was believing. Like, he had lots of people around him who were trying to explain to him the irrationality of what he was doing. They explained how these mediums were creating their stage shows through foolery rather than any paranormal gift. But he just didn't believe them. He drew on new scientific theories in very bizarre ways to try to explain why he was right and they were wrong. Even the escapologist Harry Houdini, who was a skeptic, tried to, and a real expert in stage trickery, tried to explain to him what was wrong with his thinking. And Arthur Conan Doyle just wrote this essay explaining why Harry Houdini was probably a paranormal being himself. So he thought he was part of the fairy world. So he was obviously trying to hide the truth because he didn't want to be discovered for being a paranormal being. So you can see, some very serious problems with the logical train of thinking there. And it's an extreme example, but we're all susceptible to this form of the intelligence trap, where we can use our intelligence just to rationalize what we're doing without really fairly rationally appraising the evidence at hand. And I think this is one of the reasons why we see such political polarization at the moment, because if you have both sides who are very dogmatic, just using their reasoning to support their existing point of view rather than to interrogate the evidence rationally and logically, you can get very diverging worldviews very quickly. And that can be a major problem with something like climate science, for example. And what the intelligence trap is really trying to then look at is, well, what other traits can prevent this from happening? And we see very strong evidence that cultivating curiosity, open-mindedness, learning the actual skills of critical thinking rather than just assuming they come with academic education. All of these things can be learned and taught and cultivated, and they can make us better thinkers. And often, they make up for any differences in IQ that you would have. So even someone who's got an average IQ, who learns those other ways of thinking, can end up performing very highly and outperforming people with high IQs who don't have those skills.
Interesting. And I suppose we have so many cognitive biases that sometimes we're not even aware of. We're looking at the world through a lens, and that's partly enhanced by social media nowadays, because we are all in our own little wormholes or echo chambers. Whatever you pay attention to, you'll get more of that. I mean, every time I open up YouTube Shorts pops up, and it just reinforces some of the messaging around certain things. A good example is the war in Palestine, Israel, or Ukraine. You name it, and these things are so divisive, and often the social media that's popped up reinforces whatever you've thought about that situation by showing you footage from the other side that you're going to react to, it's a little bit mind-bending. Any suggestions for just stepping back and gaining perspective and potentially some wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of got it there when you said stepping back.
Yeah.
So trying to put yourself in a distanced perspective is great to avoid this, what psychologists call motivated reasoning. So that's the kind of thinking that Arthur Conan Doyle was going through, but which we're all susceptible to. And literally just trying to imagine yourself in the perspective of someone who is a little bit removed from the context that you're talking about can be very useful. So they did some experiments, for example, on people's views of the US presidential elections, obviously events where we do see very polarized thinking. But what we found was that people showed less motivated reasoning. So they were more likely to identify the flaws in their own thinking and to take a more open-minded perspective on the facts rather than just warping them to suit their opinions. They're much more likely to take that constructive, positive outlook if they imagined how they would respond if they were someone from Iceland, for example. So someone who was quite far removed from the US, or someone from Australia even. So just trying to consider, like, what does it look like from the outside? And we can use that in our relationships. I mean, it's something that has been proven to be, it can actually save marriages. If you try to imagine, what would a fly on the wall? What would a random stranger think if they saw me and my husband arguing in this way? And that can immediately lead people to gain perspective, essentially, and to realize, what's important, what isn't. So it's a just very simple mental trick that we can use that has been shown to be very powerful. Another thing that I think is similar, because it's also about getting a little bit of distance, is just to try to interrogate our own thinking by asking, when we read like a news article, for example, or a report, and just questioning, well, would we have come to the same conclusions about the veracity of this report if it had shown us the exact opposite of what it's shown us, if the conclusions had been completely different? And how that prevents the motivated reasoning, just by getting you to recognize that where you might be criticizing in a survey, for example, the sample size or the questions that were asked or the motives of the people who've conducted this study, if you ask yourself, well, would I have had the same criticisms, or would I have overlooked those potential criticisms in the same way if the report hadn't come to this conclusion? That can just be a good way to identify some of those flaws in our thinking that we can use to rationalize our own beliefs and to dismiss others' beliefs.
David, you're always researching and writing about very interesting things. Two questions. Where can people connect with you? And what's a topic of interest to you at the moment? What's an idea that you're exploring deeply?
Okay, so I'm writing a new newsletter on Substack called 60 Second Psychology. It comes out weekly, and as the name suggests, it's really bite-sized pieces of evidence-based advice. I try to tell it in a narrative format, so it does include a mix of science and anecdote, but it's always less than 1,000 words. So you can find me on Substack or Instagram, David A. Robson. My website is davidrobson.me, and what am I working on at the moment? I'm writing a couple of pieces, one about narcissistic personality disorder, which is a topic very close to my heart. And I'm also writing a piece about effective protest. So what actually produces societal change? I'm excited about both of them.
David, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to connect. I am going to be watching this episode again to, just reinforce the learnings. We really appreciate it. Any final thoughts for those who stuck with us all the way to the end?
Thanks for, staying the course. I guess something that I just always try to emphasize with all of this is just practice self-compassion. Just be kind to yourself for your mistakes. I think that's so crucial in everything that I've spoken about. So the laws of connection, the expectation effect, and the intelligence trap is that we're much likelier to develop the constructive, positive frame of mind if we're forgiving of ourselves for the errors that we make. It makes social connection easier. It protects us from nocebo effects, and it makes it easier to change our mindset. And it can also help us to recognize the flaws in our thinking. We just recognize that it is human to make errors, and that doesn't have to reflect on us as a person, as long as we learn from those mistakes. And there's just a lot of research showing that when you practice self-compassion, you respond to stress more productively, and you're just a healthier, happier person. So don't be afraid to do that, to recognize that your self-criticism isn't getting you anywhere.
David, thank you so much. We'll see you in the next session.
It's been a pleasure.